o'clock on the dot. So we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Today we are joined by Dr. John Gardner with our very own HR department. He's going to be presenting on domestic violence as a community issue. Today is a still healthy credit eligible event, so make sure you're going out and giving yourself credit for attending after today's session. There's only 26 days until that still healthy deadline, so make sure you're getting those requirements in. But John, whenever you are ready, you can take it away.
Okay, I want to make sure you did hit record, right?
Yes, I did.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and discuss this important issue with you. As Kelsey indicated, we're talking about domestic violence as a community issue, and this is something that's really important topic. This is not an us and them discussion. This is a we discussion, as many in our community do experience, in our various communities with ATSU do experience domestic violence or even have been perpetrators of domestic violence. And so as we discuss this, it's not about what's happening to other people, it's about what's happening within our community. It's about what those of us are experiencing or may have experienced in the past. I want to recognize that if there's anything that triggers anyone, that they need to step out, turn off their video if their video happens to be on, or anything like that. Please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. That's totally understandable and totally okay. We have had many may have had someone that they love experience domestic violence. I want to recognize Natalie Basel, who was a former ATSU student who lost her life to domestic violence in 2015 when she was in medical school with us. She's a member of our SOMA community, and there are many in our community, I'm sure, who are still dealing with that loss, and so I want to recognize that as well. We hope to develop some skills today that will help everybody be more aware of domestic violence and be able to respond if they are made aware of a family member, a friend, a colleague, a coworker, a student who's experiencing domestic violence, and be able to respond to the needs of those folks. One of the things that we are going to do as a part of the presentation today is just hear and read some quotes from survivors of domestic violence. Just to kind of get a sense of what the emotional state might be, what some of the barriers are to seeking assistance and things like that. So this first one is, the biggest thing for me was when I got to the point where I could let go of responsibility for my husband's actions. I held myself accountable for a long time. I think this is a really important quote, because one of the aspects of domestic violence is the victim survivor takes accountability for the abuser's actions, and that's a really due to often the psychological and emotional manipulation in the process. That's something that's very hard to get over, and is one of the reasons why it's hard to get out of that cycle of abuse, even for what many on the outside may seem as an obvious decision to leave the relationship. Can be very complicated based on how it's being viewed by the victim survivor, how the manipulation and the controlling behavior has impacted that perception. Today we're going to talk about the definitions of domestic violence and the various types, the individual impact of domestic violence on victim survivors, the community impact that domestic violence has on the greater community around those people. Responding to reports of domestic violence. So if you are aware someone may be experiencing domestic violence, if you're experiencing domestic violence, if you notice signs of domestic violence, what you can do to respond to those. And then look at some of the resources that are available nationwide that can help us find individual resources within our community. Because this is not something that someone can usually get out of on their own. They usually need assistance from their community, from their support, and from other resources as well. Another quote that has come up that I found was, "I believe this is a normal thing that happened in relationships. The environment I was raised in catered to what boys and men wanted. I was used to living in a cultural and social perspective of masculine dominance, with women being quiet and obedient." And so this quote obviously refers to a dynamic in which a male or man is the perpetrator or the abuser, and a woman is the victim or survivor, which is what happens in the vast majority of domestic violence situations. Not all of the situations. Women can abuse men, women can abuse women, men can abuse men. Our trans community, our gender non-binary community can certainly be in domestic violence situations as well. But the most common situation by a pretty large percentage is men abusing women. And so what you see this person talking about is the dynamic of the environment of the relationship being catered to what boys and men want, and some of that being related to masculinity, and what some might refer to as toxic masculinity. So let's get into the definitions of what domestic violence is. Many of us view domestic violence as when an intimate partner violently assaults their other intimate partner, and so. But domestic violence can be a lot of different things. The main concept with domestic violence is an attempt to exert power and maintain power over another. And so sometimes that involves violence, and that's probably the most common concept of domestic violence that we recognize, an attempt to cause or place another in fear of physical injury or pain. Is usually what we refer to. Sometimes that's associated with psychological or emotional violence as well. And the potential victims are almost always current or former spouses, relatives by blood or marriage. So domestic violence can involve children, can involve elder abuse, things like that. Can be a current or former cohabitant, so somebody that somebody lives with or used to live with, and current or former romantic or intimate partners. So don't necessarily have to live together for domestic violence to occur, or somebody that co-parents with somebody else, so they share a child, or something like that. So with domestic violence, there's usually a cycle of abuse that occurs, and there's different models for this and how it works. Some of them are 3-stage models. Some of them are like 6-stage models, like this one. I like this one because it talks about some different stages that you go through before the violence and after the violence that are a little bit more specific. So the build-up phase is about creation of tension in the relationship. And so that tension can come from a variety of different places. It can come from who someone's associating with. It can be economic tensions. It can be sexual tensions. It can be a lot of different things. And then the next stage is what's called the standover phase. And that's where the abuser will begin to be more aggressive, have some verbal attacks, and that kind of thing. It'll be just a little bit more usually verbally violent without usually being physically violent in that standover phase. And it's sort of creating the dynamic of who's in control of the relationship and things like that. And the explosion phase is where you typically see either physical violence or some other type of violence. And so that can be breaking something, damaging something, hurting someone physically, that kind of stuff. And so that violent outburst occurs, and that's usually a shorter term phase. The build-up phase can be longer. The standover phase usually a little bit shorter, and then the explosion phase is usually a relatively short phase. With that being followed by the remorse phase, which is actually not usually the abuser indicating remorse, but more so the abuser trying to explain what occurred, and oftentimes using that opportunity to put blame on the victim survivor. So indicating that things the victim survivor did that caused the abuser to engage in the actions they did during the explosion phase. The pursuit phase usually involves promises and apologies. Things won't happen again like that. That was a one-time thing. I love you, all those kinds of things, to encourage the victim survivor to stay in the relationship, to indicate that it was a mistake and it won't happen again, things of that nature. And then the honeymoon phase is the period of time after the explanations and the promises are made before we start to see that tension and that build-up phase occur again. These phases don't necessarily always go in exact order, and they don't always, the length of time for the phases can vary quite a bit. A honeymoon phase can last quite a long time. A build-up phase can last quite a long time, or be very short. It just very much depends on the specific situation and the people involved. And so that abuse cycle is something where some of that psychological control comes in terms of something clearly very bad has happened, and then trying to keep that person in the relationship, even though the abuser's done something very bad to them. Thinking about the characteristics of abusers, they are obviously controlling, as I indicated early on. The very definition of domestic abuse is about control, less so than violence. Violence is something that happens because of the control, but it is not the reason for the behavior. Manipulative, that's a big component of this. Psychological manipulation, physical, financial, social manipulation, a lot of different manipulation that occurs. If men are the abuser, which as I indicated, they most commonly are, they may have a belief that men are preordained to control all aspects of a relationship. And therefore their behavior is explained within that worldview or conceptual view of the world. Abusers often see themselves as victims, that their actions are only the response to actions of the victim survivors. And so sort of inverting that, why the behavior occurred and what caused the behavior and things of that nature. And so that's when you've seen that remorse phase, when they sort of explain their behavior. The behavior is explained because of what the victim survivor did. One thing that can be hard viewing from the outside, if you haven't been involved in domestic violence, is why victims may not leave. And there's a lot of reasons. Most of them are tied into the psychological components of domestic violence. One thing is that sometimes victims are not aware that they are experiencing the abuse. There's an example I read where a couple had been in a relationship where the woman had not been working, the man had been working, and he had had tight control over the finances for many years. And this is kind of an example of economic abuse where he had controlled her access to money and what she could do, how she could spend, tracking her expenses of finances and things like that. At some point, she did go out and get a job. And so then she had access to more money, access to additional things. This caused a lot of distress for him, and he started acting out and becoming more abusive in other ways, verbally very abusive. He would damage items. He became very mentally unstable, and realized he needed to go see a counselor. And it was at the counselor that they both recognized that what had been happening for decades previous to her getting a job was that he had been financially and economically abusing her through the use of financial funds and restricting her movement and access. And so sometimes you may not even be aware the abuse is happening. Many fear that leaving will cost too much. If there are children involved, often there's threats that you'll never see the kids again if you leave. Bad things will happen to the kids, things like that. Loss of financial standing. Oftentimes the abuser has financial control in the relationship, and so it is hard to imagine leaving and going out and not having access to resources. Isolation from a peer group can certainly cause a lot of concern if that's your support group and those that you rely on for resources and support and who you hang out with and things like that. Leaving someone, there can be a lot of threats that you'll never be involved in that group again. So there's just a lot of things that are risks, that maybe costs of leaving the relationship if someone even wants to and recognizes what's occurring. There may be a fear of escalation in violence. 1 in 5 homicides in the United States are committed by a domestic partner, and 1 in 2 women who are murdered are killed by their partner. And so when you look at what's going on with those numbers, you have a large amount of risk there where women especially, but anybody may risk that if they're in a domestic violence situation, that the next stage of escalation may be death. And so that's a real concern. there may be an escalation in violence that isn't against the person who's the victim survivor. There may be threats against children. There may be threats against pets. The abuser may make threats that they'll take their own life. And so there's a lot of concerns about escalation and violence that keep people trapped in those relationships. Also, for many people, sometimes it's just not a conceivable option to leave. What to do, how to live outside of that relationship can be very hard, it can be very challenging. Again, I talked earlier on about many people view domestic violence through the lens of someone physically abusing somebody else, and that's something that we commonly see with domestic violence. But it can also show up in a number of other ways. Economic abuse. I talked about that example of the couple where the woman didn't work and didn't have access to resources, and one way to maintain control over somebody is to not give them access to finances. If you can't spend money, if you can't go places, if you can't go out to eat, if you can't buy clothes, if you can't get access to medical care and things like that, then that's one way to exert control over somebody. And so if one person has all the control over the money, they demand accountability for any expenses that are made, and things of that nature. That's a way to exert control and exert a type of violence over somebody else. And so how those situations work out can be connected to domestic violence. And it is often noted that these different types of domestic violence don't exist in a vacuum. Economic abuse can go along with physical violence and things of that nature. Psychological and emotional abuse is also very common, and it's something that we see where we have opportunities where folks are abused through using emotions to criticize, embarrass, shame, blame, or otherwise manipulate another person. And so it's not that we, those of us that have partners, don't necessarily criticize our partner from time to time about things, but it's about a pattern of these things that wear down an individual, create self-esteem issues, perhaps cause mental and emotional imbalances, may lead to depression, PTSD, things of that nature tend to show up sometimes with psychological and emotional abuse, and that pattern of how you're treating a person, deliberately doing something to make the person feel diminished or embarrassed or isolating them. So that's another type of abuse, psychological and emotional abuse. Also looking at sexual abuse. So there are opportunities in relationships where folks force people to have sex or do things sexually that they don't want to do, making them feel like they owe you sex. Consent is obviously something that's very important in any sexual behavior that occurs, and oftentimes manipulation and controlling behavior can reduce the ability for someone to feel like they have the opportunity to provide consent in these situations. This can also show up with folks requiring people to dress in a certain way, sexually provocative perhaps in a way that somebody does not wish to dress. Maybe tries to give someone an STD or something of that nature as a way to abuse them sexually, or won't use birth control. That's another way that we're not engaging sexually in a way that's consensual. Social abuse is really about isolation. It's really about cutting people off from their family, from their friends, from their other support group, so that the victim survivor has to totally see their whole world as the world that is connected to the abuser. And so there's nobody else to talk to, there's nobody else to go see, there's nobody else that could help and maybe identify that what's going on with their relationship is not healthy at this time. And so that social abuse is really about isolating an individual from those that support them and love them. All right. And I think it's just important, I'll just say, again, and reiterate that these types of abuse don't happen usually in an isolated way. Social abuse often goes along with some of, economic abuse, because if you can't go out and spend money, you can't go out and see people, you can't go out and have fun, those kinds of things, those are often interconnected. Physical domestic violence ties into a lot of these. Psychological and emotional abuse are connected with almost any of them. And so these are all things that tend to happen connected to one another in one way or another. Another quote from a survivor of domestic violence: "You want to say something, but worry that what you do, it could come back worse." I think that's why a lot of people don't report. They think no one's going to believe them, and they're afraid of what's going to happen to them. So we talked earlier about the fear of escalation in terms of why people, why victim survivors maybe don't leave domestic violence situations. And there's a lot of concern about, will someone believe me, or will they believe the abuser? And why would they believe me? Especially if you've been isolated, if you don't have strong relationships with other people, it's hard to believe that anyone would believe you. Who would have your back in that scenario? And if you do, and it doesn't work out, then what is going to be the escalation by the abuser? And that can be a real concern. So looking at the individual impact of domestic violence, and I think we've talked about some of this stuff in terms of how it impacts individuals, but there are about 1.5 to 2 million victim survivors of domestic violence in the US annually, depending on which source that you go to. And about 85% of those are women. Some sources have that as low as 65% are women, but the majority are women, and the majority of abusers are men. And so that's typically the dynamic you see. But again, as I mentioned earlier, you can see any type of dynamic. Women can abuse men, women can abuse women, men can abuse men, and certainly our trans and gender non-binary community are abused as well. And so that's something to note. The impact in the moment with the domestic violence is definitely, there's a physical safety component. If someone is being physically abused, then there are the actual injuries they sustain. There's also the fear of future injuries, that and the trauma from past injuries. And so that physical safety component is very critical and impactful. The mental health component, almost any type of domestic violence is going to have a traumatic impact. There's going to be trauma that the person has to deal with. Additionally, there can be self-esteem issues. There can be other mental health concerns that arise, such as depression, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, things of that nature. The professional impact. If someone is experiencing domestic violence, they may not be able to have access to a professional career. They may not be able to grow in their professional career. They may miss time because of injuries or other mental health concerns that they have to address. So there's a professional impact on the individual. Socially, the individual may not be able to have a connected social environment they can be part of, or they may fear the response from, depending on who they hang out with, what they do, how long they're gone, all of those things. So the social impact can be very severe. Lack of access to resources, the resources that an individual may need for things as simple as clothing, food, medical care, they may be denied those things, and so that can be very impactful as well. Thinking about the future impact, even if someone were to get out of the situation, and the situation is not ongoing in terms of domestic violence, domestic violence increases lifelong vulnerability to a broad range of emotional, behavioral, and physical health problems. When you look at the emotional and behavioral, if there's PTSD, if there's traumatic response, if there's other mental health concerns that come out of having experienced the domestic violence, those can go on for a very long time if they ever go away. Physical health problems can continue as well. Studies have shown that there's negative health outcomes related to heart, digestive, reproduction, muscle and bone, and nervous system. And so even though someone may have been able to get out of the situation physically, they may still deal with it for many, many years to come. And that's, deeply problematic, obviously, situation to deal with for somebody who's experienced domestic violence. The community impact. I struggled to find more recent data, but in 2011, it's estimated that 504,000 people worldwide were killed because of domestic violence. And as I mentioned earlier, 1 in 5 homicides are committed by a partner, and for women, I believe it's 1 in 2 homicides of women are committed by a partner. And so when you look at that, the impact on a community of 504,000 people no longer being here every year is significant. There's sisters and brothers of those people, there's parents, there's children, there's work colleagues, there's friends, all of those people that are impacted by the loss of those individuals. Not to mention anybody else who is just experiencing domestic violence and didn't end up being murdered. They are impacting their friends, their families. Those relationships are impacted, and so really the impact is very significant. I'm going to talk a little bit about economic impact, and I think the important thing around domestic violence is the trauma someone feels, if it's physical violence, the physical things that they feel, how they're cut off and that kind of thing. So I'm not putting economic impact on par with those. I just want to kind of explain what some of the economic impact is, though. There's 8 million days of work are lost in the United States every year because of domestic violence, because of people needing to seek medical attention, seek counseling, seek legal recourse, try to be resheltered, try to just seek the assistance that they need. $1.8 billion is lost in productivity for those individuals, for the companies that they work for. 16% of businesses indicated domestic violence incident in their property over the last 5 years. So it's not just that they have employees that are experiencing this, it's that the incidents are occurring on their property. So I think what we know is domestic violence is incredibly difficult for those that are directly involved with it. And then the ripple effect of that impact is substantial. And so if anyone here has ever known someone that's experienced domestic violence, you know how hard that is to watch that and try to help. It's just a very difficult thing, and so that community impact is not small at all. Another quote from a survivor of domestic violence: "No one understood what I was going through and what it was like in that relationship. But when we were apart, I realized how great it felt to be away from him. I really wanted that freedom." And so this is a person who recognized in the relationship that they wanted the freedom, but it was still not easy to get away. And that they could not explain to peers or someone that was a support person, even if they had those support persons, which is, I don't know who this individual is, so I can't say that they did or didn't, but what it was like to be in that relationship. And I think it's so hard for people to understand and to know, who are not directly involved in that relationship, what it's like. And so I think this is a really important quote to consider. So I want to talk about things that we can do to reduce the likelihood of domestic violence, interrupt domestic violence and pathways to violence that we may see in our communities, we may notice with our friends, with our family members, and how we can be involved and part of the solution. So one of the things is about being proactive. It's really important, I think, that we consider ways that we can get ahead of domestic violence. Responding to someone that's experiencing domestic violence is obviously something we want to do, and I'll talk to that here in a little bit. But I think proactive measures are just as important in terms of trying to reduce the likelihood this occurs. So one is to teach healthy and safe relationship skills. And so I think as we're thinking about young people in our community, but really anyone in our community that we have the opportunity to talk to about relationships, that we talk about what does a healthy relationship look like? What does consensual agreements around everything from how we touch one another, to how we talk about money, to how we engage socially, to how we engage with our families. All of those things should be things that we are doing consensually, that we discuss, that we come to agreements with. And thinking about social and emotional learning programs for youth. How do we get those in our schools or other social environments that our students are in? How do we encourage good and open communication? How do we encourage vulnerability around these topics so that we can encourage those relationships to be strong and for folks to understand what those look like? And thinking about our older population outside of schools, thinking about how do we have opportunities for engagement around healthy relationship programs for couples. I know there are some institutions that provide pre-marriage counseling or couples counseling for people that are in serious relationships. I think that's a great opportunity to do some of these things and begin in some of these topics, but really getting into about what are the healthy and safe relationships are, so we can head off these issues. And if there are signs of domestic violence potentially showing up in a relationship, that the folks in those relationships can identify those and either get out of the relationship or fix the behavior. Engaging influential adults and peers. And so I think one of the biggest things is to show examples about what healthy relationships are. For those of us in relationships, to be able to demonstrate to our friends, our young people in our community, our kids, anyone else, what a healthy relationship looks like, be able to talk about that and to be able to be involved in that and show what that looks like. Now, not the only perpetrators of domestic violence are men, but that is a large percentage of perpetrators. And men and boys, thinking about as allies in prevention, and so thinking about how men and boys engage with each other and talk with each other about their relationships, avoiding discussions that lead to areas of toxic masculinity, and things of that nature in terms of how we talk about our relationships with other people, and standing up when those conversations head in directions that are not supportive of a healthy viewpoint of relationships. Bystander empowerment and education, so encouraging our friends and colleagues to understand when behavior and comments and things like that are inappropriate, and understand how to engage and intervene in those situations as a bystander, not only when we see things that are obviously domestic violence, but when we see or hear about concerning comments or behaviors, how we can engage in those. Hopefully I'll give you some of those skills today. Disrupting developmental pathways towards partner violence. So some of this is that we see is set up in our school systems, early childhood and things like that. When we have evidence that there might be violence in a home, how can we engage those families through our school systems, through our social support networks, to intervene and find out what's going on, help that child in the school have better examples of what healthy relationships are, help that couple and that family to intervene and make sure that those things are being addressed, and then we can reduce the likelihood of domestic violence within that environment. Skills on family relationship programs, and just identifying folks that may be at risk for bad modeling regarding relationships, and also addressing a behavior that is domestic violence. Creating protective environments. So having safe places for people to go is really important. So having schools as safe places, having workplaces as safe places where people can go and seek assistance and know that there are resources for them. One of the reasons why we're doing this program is to make sure folks know that ATSU is a safe place, and then we have resources in place if people need assistance. And really making sure that folks understand that. And then strengthening economic support for families. One of the biggest stressors that families have is economic and financial stress. And so are there ways to help families gain skills in economic and financial areas? Are there ways for the community to support families so that stressor maybe is reduced, which reduces the likelihood of tension building, which reduces the likelihood of domestic violence and that violent outburst down the road, if we can head off some of those issues. Some indications that someone may be experiencing abuse. If your partner is attempting to cut you off from friends and family, or somebody else in your life is attempting to cut you off from friends and family. If someone's extremely jealous or upset if you spend time away from them, if they are constantly checking on you, constantly trying to figure out where you are, if they insult you, put you down so that you can never do anything right. If they try to prevent you from attending work or school or other social functions, perhaps, to try to limit your interaction with other people. Destroy your property, attempt to harm your pets or anyone else in your life. prevent you from making decisions for yourself, trying to control your decision-making process or what the outcome of those decisions are. Threatens to harm your children, take them away from you. Again, putting you down more, telling you that you're worthless. No one else could ever love you. So if you left here, you're just going to be on your own forever. That kind of thing. Trying to isolate you from others. Controlling finances. That goes back to that economic and financial abuse. Signs that someone you know might be being abused. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a second because I just want to show you something. So there's something that somebody can do on a Zoom call to indicate to you that they're being abused. And I just want everybody on this call to know this. So if somebody puts up their hand like this while they're talking on a Zoom call, they can be talking about whatever. They're not probably going to be talking about domestic violence. And they put their thumb in the middle of their hand and they cover their hand with their 4 fingers. That's an indication that they're trying to tell you that they're in an abusive relationship and that they need help. And so it's just they put their hand up, they put their thumb, and they cover their fingers. And so that's an indication that I want you all to be aware that someone may be being abused and that they may be trying to communicate that to you through a Zoom call, and they may need your assistance and they may need you to reach out to them. Probably not in writing form. You don't want to necessarily do a text or an email or something like that because that may be being tracked, but that's an indication that someone may be being abused and they're trying to communicate that to you. Somebody may also indicate they may have some injuries and they may, the reasons or the excuses for those injuries seem to not really add up. Everybody is clumsy and can get injured sometimes, but it may be that you have concerns about whether or not those reasons are really making much sense. If someone has personality changes, somebody maybe is outgoing and was confident, now they're reserved, they seem a little depressed, things like that. Not always related to domestic violence, but can be a reason. It's always a good reason to check on someone if they have some personality changes. Constantly checking in with their partner. So this can be an indication either way. If someone's constantly trying to find out what their partner's up to, they may indicate that they're the abuser in that relationship, or someone's constantly replying and telling their partner what they're doing. It may be that they are being abused, the victim or survivor. Never having money on hand, so they don't maybe have access to the resources that they have had previously. They've been cut off for some reason. They're overly worried about pleasing their partner. So everything seems focused on what are they going to think about this? What's my partner going to think about it? What's going on with my partner? Are they going to like that they did this? Are they not going to like that I did this? Things like that. Skipping out on work or school or social outings. So if all of a sudden people are missing work a lot or not going to the social outings that they used to in the past. Wearing clothes that don't fit in the season. So this is most commonly you'd see in like a summer month or in a warm environment that somebody is maybe wearing long sleeve clothes or multi layers or things like that that don't seem appropriate to the season. So if we're identifying these things, if we see these things in somebody that we know or somebody that we love, responding to these concerns can be pretty tricky because of the psychological components of domestic violence. Just kind of saying, oh, you're in a bad relationship and they're treating you poorly and they're doing these bad things, and someone's usually not going to respond to that by saying like, oh, thanks for telling me, I'm going to get out of this relationship now. That's not usually how it goes. So it tends to be very complicated. You don't want to rush in and send a lot of texts or send a lot of emails. You want to approach the issue carefully, and you want to do it in a timely way. You don't want to wait a long time to do it, but you want to do it in a way that is smart and intelligent and allows the person to be protected from what you're bringing to their attention. Because there may be tracking of electronic communication. That's something that we see more and more. So how to approach someone who you think may be experiencing domestic violence is it's best to have a face-to-face conversation or perhaps an over-the-phone conversation where it's harder for somebody else to track what's being said and what's going on. So one thing to do is to ask if anything is wrong. And you might indicate pretty specifically like, I'm concerned because you had that injury to your eye. And then, your behavior's changed a little bit. You become more reserved. You're not as outgoing. You've stopped coming out on our social functions. And I just want to make sure you're doing okay. That just concerns me a little bit. And then listen very carefully to what they say. Don't judge what they're telling you. Don't judge their response to your questions. Don't be surprised if there is clear indication of abuse that the victim or survivor explains or excuses the abuse. One of the common things, and if you remember from our first quote that we read today, is that the person talked about how the fact that they were taking responsibility for their partner's abuse. And I think that's it's not unusual. And so don't be surprised, don't be outraged at that. Maybe try to help the person understand, like, you don't deserve that behavior and that's not your responsibility. But don't fight with them necessarily. Just sort of make that point to them that that's not on you. And offer to help. Offer to help and talk about some of the different ways that you can provide help. And we'll talk through a couple of different resources here at the end. But in the end, you need to support their choices. They may not choose to leave the relationship immediately, and that will be hard on you. But you just need to continue to be there for them and continue to support their choices and continue to offer to help and continue to bring up the concerns that you have. Because it may not be the first conversation you have with them that they choose to leave the relationship, and it may not be the second, but it may be the fifth, or it may be the 10th. But continuing to be there for them is very important. Many times victims of domestic violence, because of the environment that the abuser has tried to create for them, have very few resources and places to go. And so if you can be that for that person in a safe way, that's a really wonderful thing. Help them in the way that they are able to be helped. Making them aware of those resources. If they want to use the domestic violence hotline, or if they want to access an online resource, perhaps give them access to your phone or to your computer so that that can be done there, and so it's less likely that it will be tracked. And just understand the complexity of that situation. I think that can be really important. See, I'm getting a comment here. I just want to read this comment. It may make them mad because they're afraid to let anyone know that they are abused. And if you can see it, their abuser might. I think that's a great comment, that they may respond angrily to this issue, to you bringing this up to them. And that's okay if they're mad at you about it. Just continue to be there. Thanks for that comment, Mindy. And just really understand the complexity of the situation. This isn't easy for them. And they may be frustrated about it. They may be aware of it. They may not be aware of kind of what's going on. They may not understand how it's viewed to other people. And their reaction to that, yeah, is going to be complex. Just continue to develop trust with them. Continue to be there for them, and give them those options that they have, so that they are aware of those, because they may not be aware of those. They may not have the ability to explore those on their own, but you maybe can help them be more aware. Help them develop a safety plan. If they are considering maybe leaving the situation, they may need like a go bag, an emergency bag that will have clothes and other important supplies, like important papers, some money that they're able to gather up if they have difficulty getting access to resources. You may need to provide some resources for them. If they don't have access to money, you may need to help them with that if you're able to. If they don't have access to other things that you can help them with, that would be a great resource for them, I'm sure. But help them sort of develop a plan to leave safely and quickly, if you can. Perhaps work with them on a code word that they could text to you or say to you in a phone call or in person that would indicate that they're in a dangerous situation and that maybe some quick action needs to be made. And then what do they want you to do if they use that code word? Developing a plan to call the police, which might involve that code word as well. So police are involved, and these are complicated situations for police too, because of how charges work and that kind of thing. But police can be a great resource in these situations, at least intervening in the immediate sense. And how that goes from there is tricky based on a person's willing to participate in the investigation and things like that. But having a plan to call the police is important. Become familiar with safe places. So identify places the person could go that are safe, that is less likely that the abuser will show up at, and help them know those places, know how to get those places, have that safe place in mind. What's the route they're going to take, all those kinds of things, so that you're able to sort of determine their safety. Technology safety is Is there going to be another phone that they would have that the abuser wouldn't know about in their to-go bag, or access to a computer, access to internet, things like that. Those things can be important when trying to get out of those situations. And then developing excuses why a person, so that person can develop excuses and create habits of things that they tell their abuser about why they need to leave the house, so it's not obvious as to why they're going. And so if their behavior and where they go and things like that are tightly controlled, start to develop some habits where they can get away from the house at least far enough away that then they could leave without the abuser being in pursuit of them immediately. A few resources I just want to go through. The Domestic Violence Hotline, National Domestic Violence Hotline, is a terrific resource. They have a phone number. They have a great website that's really useful. You can also text text start to 88788, and then they'll start providing resources for someone and ask what's needed, and can provide resources in a specific area. Domestic Shelters is a great resource in terms of finding shelters in your area. If someone needs to find a place to stay, that's another thing, that if you're helping someone who is experiencing domestic violence, or if you need help and you're experiencing domestic violence and you have a friend that can maybe provide a hotel room for a night or two when you initially are getting away, that can be a great resource as well. Legal Services Corporation is a government entity that can provide some legal assistance. That can be important if someone is married, if someone has, if there's a custody issue with children, if there's property issues involved. So that's a good resource. Family Violence Prevention Services provides a number of different services, another government entity. But one of the services they also provide is legal services. Futures Without Violence is a resource, and I didn't find a lot of resources for perpetrators, for abusers, but this is one that talks about engaging with men who use violence, and how to make changes in those behaviors. So that's a good resource. Also want to put our employee assistance program out there. Provides free resources for folks, counseling, legal assistance, a variety of other things that are available there through our employee assistance program. So there's the phone number, and you can also go to MyCigna to access that as well. And so that's a great resource that we have as members of our ATSU community. And Kelsey, if I recall, anybody in the same home can use that resource, right? Employee assistance program.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay,
Household members.
household members. Thank you. I just want to talk about a couple of laws and ATSU policy as it relates to this, and then I'll be finished up here. California and Missouri have laws protecting victims, survivors of domestic violence in the workplace. So there's time off to seek medical attention, sheltering, counseling, safety planning, legal assistance. Folks can take up to 2 weeks and their employment's protected. And then the employer would take steps also, if there's domestic violence, to make sure that the employee is protected in the work environment. And as I sent out today, we have just put in place a policy that provides these same protections for all ATSU employees, regardless of where they work. So whether you're in Mesa, New York, Minneapolis, wherever you are, if you experience domestic violence, let us know, and we will give you time off to do the things that you need to do in order to improve your situation, and we'll provide whatever assistance we can. You can work through your supervisor on that, or through human resources, whatever is your preference. I do want to encourage, if anyone is aware of students experiencing domestic violence, or if there's any domestic violence between ATSU community members, we want to make sure that's reported to me, so that we can make sure that that person gets the resources that they need. It's part of our expectations under the Violence Against Women's Act, but applies to all members of our community. And so please, if you're aware of anything like that, please let me know. And again, that's something where we follow the same process of connecting with that person in a safe and responsible way, where the information, in case there's electronic tracking, won't be identified, and find a way to have a conversation about what they need and what they would like to do. And then just real quickly about restraining orders, there's ex parte restraining orders, which are kind of like temporary restraining orders. They usually are in place about 15 days, that people can ask for from the courts. And so that depends on, you know, submitting a request for that based on the details of the domestic violence that someone might be experiencing. And then there's usually a hearing for a full order of protection. Full orders of protection usually are in place for 6 months or a year is sort of the typical thing. But if a judge grants one, it can be in place in some places for as long as 10 years. So it just sort of depends, but those are another legal protection that's in place. So that is my presentation. I welcome any questions or comments. I noticed there's some people here on the call that might know even more about this topic than I. So if there's suggestions or other things people want to say, please don't hesitate to jump in.
No questions yet, John, but thank you for sharing that. A lot of good information there. But as he said, if you guys have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself, even if you want to ask those out loud or enter those in the chat box.
Kelsey, I'm going to make one suggestion. When I was doing law enforcement, when law enforcement gets involved, they will look for the aggressor. Say the man and the women are fighting. One of them is more aggressor than the other, but he doesn't leave the marks. When the law enforcement gets there and see who has the marks on him the most, and if your abuser is wise to that, they're going to keep those to where those marks can't be seen. So that's something to keep in mind. You know, you want to try to save yourself and protect yourself. But if you're trying to protect yourself and you put more marks on your abuser, then that's going to be an issue too. So that's just how law enforcement is trained.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mindy. I think that just adds the complexity of it, right? You're trying to defend yourself in a situation, and it may end up being that because of that vantage point, it actually ends up worse for you. So it's just such a complex situation, but I really appreciate that perspective. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, that's just because of it was a great presentation, John. That's why. So
I think it's all
informative.
the topics I do. I almost never get questions on my presentations.
It's very informative. That's why. So anyway, we do appreciate you joining us and sharing the information. And today is a Still Healthy seminar. Just a reminder, go out and give yourself credit for today's event. You have 26 days until the deadline. So make sure you are getting those requirements in. If you have questions and you just didn't want to, you know, ask them today, I'm sure John would welcome any questions afterwards if you want to meet with him one-on-one. So, all right, with that, we will conclude today's seminar, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thank you.